Our first speaker is going to talk about globalization as a threat to democracy. This is an angle that maybe most of us haven't thought of or don't know much about, but it is important that we learn how globalists could threaten our sovereignty and our democracy. Speaking on this issue, I'm very pleased to welcome back Reggie Littlejohn, who is the president of the Anti-Globalist International. In addition to that organization and to her co-founding the Sovereignty Coalition, Reggie Littlejohn is the founder and president of Women's Rights Without Frontiers, a broad-based international coalition that opposes forced abortion and sexual slavery in China. Reggie has spoken to us before, always does an amazing job, and we're very pleased to welcome him back. So thank you, Reggie.
Thank you so much, David, and thanks to Davos in the desert for all the time and effort it took to organize this extremely complete and detailed conference with all kinds of outstanding experts to try to save our democracy. And friends, we are at war. Okay, but we don't even know it. And there is a war on our democracy. We are living in a globalist coup effectuated by wealthy and powerful international organizations to enslave humanity to their own advantage. And this coup is being perpetrated through various unaccountable, unelected globalist bodies, such as the United Nations, the World Economic Forum, the World Health Organization, and they have been heavily influenced by the Chinese Communist Party. So these globalist entities they grab power by creating crises that promote chaos, division, and fear. And such crises can include pandemics, economic, banking, food, energy, environmental crises, the internet or the power grid going down. They serve as an opportunity to impose emergency powers under the pretext of providing safety and security. These emergency powers are then used to curtail freedom and to establish a global totalitarian infrastructure. So never before has humanity been so close to losing our freedom and entering a digital dark age. So could you please put the first slide up? Is that the one that's just Anti-Globalist International? I cannot see.
Yeah, Mark, if you can do that, please. Great, we have it up.
Okay, great. So that's why I founded Anti-Globalist International. As David mentioned, I also co-founded the Sovereignty Coalition, and we've had tremendous success in raising the awareness of these issues domestically within the United States, and even advocating to Congress, and Congress has taken action, I believe in large part based on the advocacy and the information given by the Sovereignty Coalition. So I am taking this worldwide to try to stop this globalist coup. You can't just focus on the United States. You have to focus on the whole world. It's a worldwide problem, and it takes a worldwide resistance. So I want to focus on two organizations. One is the World Health Organization, and the other is the United Nations, both of whom have been taking action recently to our detriment. The World Health Organization, basically, it has passed an instrument that would give them power to effectuate a one world government through a health crisis. And the United Nations has recently passed an instrument that would enable them to basically install one world government on the basis of a complex global shock, which would include all kinds of things that I will tell you. It's not just healthcare. So you've got, like, for example, climate change. So you've got the World Health Organization focusing on health, and the United Nations focusing on everything else. So the World Health Organization on June 1st, I believe it was, of 2024, in Geneva, they passed, okay, you can take the first slide down, by the way. The World Health Organization passed amendments to the International Health Regulations on June 1st of 2024 in Geneva. I was there for that meeting. I was one of 10 lawyers internationally talking about how all the dangers of this. But there were two things that passed. Well, actually, what I should say is they did not pass the pandemic treaty, but that's not a great victory because they're still just continuing to negotiate that. It's not like it went away. But even if the pandemic treaty never gets signed into law, nevertheless, what did pass, the international health regulation amendments, are enough to establish a biotech surveillance totalitarian police state. And so what was passed in there? Couple things are of particular concern. One is, and this is something that's shared by the United Nations instrument that passed, which is the issue of addressing, is what they call it, addressing misinformation and disinformation. And so they don't define these terms, but I would submit to you that we can see what the definition is going to be, because from what it has been, like under COVID, misinformation and disinformation was basically anything that was counter to the narrative of the World Health Organization, the United Nations, the CDC, and the whole mainstream media. So, for example, in the beginning of COVID, if you had said something which turned out to be true, but it was against the narrative at the time, it would have been considered misinformation and disinformation. For example, in the beginning, the World Health Organization was saying that this was not a lab leak, that this was, from a bat or pangolin. If you had said, no, this looks like a lab leak, that would have been misinformation, disinformation. You would have been censored. The World Health Organization was also saying that that COVID was not transmissible between humans. What a joke, And if you had said it is transmissible, then that would have been misinformation and disinformation. So they had said that the vaccine is completely safe and effective. And if you said, you know what, there are people who are being injured and it's not effective, it's not preventing infection, it's not preventing transmission, that would have been misinformation and disinformation. So what they're trying to do is, and then you will be censored, or worse, and we can talk about that. What they have set in place, both the United Nations and the World Health Organization have set in place a system by which, through AI, they can identify who is saying what and censor them and punish them, like doctors who were saying the things I just said, like it is transmissible, or they're questioning whether you need a vaccine or whether you could have early treatment, etc. A lot of those doctors were punished by having their licenses suspended. So what they're doing is they are controlling the narrative, and that is a threat to democracy. We're talking about threat to democracy here. Controlling the narrative is a threat to democracy and a threat to our sovereignty. Because what is sovereignty? Sovereignty is your ability to make decisions, informed decisions about yourself. That's personal sovereignty, or a nation, will make decisions how it's going to handle a situation. That's national sovereignty. And in order to have real sovereignty, you have to have real information. You have to have access to the facts. That's why we have the First Amendment. So this is a direct violation of the First Amendment. But the idea in democracy is that we have this thing called the marketplace of ideas, where one side says one thing and somebody else says something else and something else says something else, and then you battle it out in the marketplace of ideas, and hopefully the truth will emerge. And so by censoring us and by punishing people who continue to say things that are counter-narrative, that is a threat to democracy in itself. And I should add that that the United Nations, not only the instrument that they passed recently, called a Pact for the Future, not only talks about misinformation and disinformation, but also hate speech. And this is another thing that's really concerning, because there is an abuse of hate speech laws. And they don't really define what hate speech is, but I would also say that hate speech is, that they would define hate speech as anything that goes against their agenda. So that if somebody takes typical, biblical views on, marriage or gender or pro-life, that could be considered to be hate speech. And again, you can be censored, you can be punished. So that was one part of what passed with the World Health Organization, amendments to the international health regulations, which, by the way, I think is a treaty thank goodness, we were able, the Sovereignty Coalition basically was able to advocate that position, I think, quite effectively. And the House of Representatives passed a bill saying that any agreement coming out of the World Health Organization is a treaty and has to be passed only, with the advice and consent of the Senate. That has not gone to the Senate yet, but that is a step in the right direction. I'm just going to digress here, which is that a lot of conservatives sort of comfort themselves by saying, "Oh, something is that's unconstitutional. It'll never happen. Our Constitution will protect us." The Constitution is a treasured weapon, like a golden sword with gems on it that's been passed down to us by the founders of our nation, and it's something we can use to defend ourselves. But if we just put it on the wall and say, "Oh, look at that beautiful sword. Look at all the gems it has. And I'm so glad that we have this and that it will defend us." It's not going to defend us. You have to take the thing off the wall, learn to use it, and actually use it for our Constitution to defend us. So don't comfort yourself by saying, "Oh, this will never pass through the Senate," because presidents, starting with Obama, or probably before Obama, but started just passing these what really amount to treaties through executive orders and not going through the Senate. And that it is unconstitutional, but nobody has fought back strongly enough to stop it. We need to resist. So regarding hate speech, that's they can identify anybody who has traditional biblical values, for example, as hate speech, and they can even identify the Bible itself as hate speech. I understand that happened in one of the Scandinavian countries, that the Bible was decided to be hate speech because it has scripture in it that contradicts the views of the UN, etc. So the other thing that passed in the amended international health regulations was a digital ID. Okay, so could you put the digital ID chart up, the next slide? So what passed with the World Health Organization is more like a health ID. There you go. I don't know if you can make that bigger so that the images that can be seen larger. But in any case, the pretext is health, but in Annex A of the International Health Regulation amendments, they require every person on Earth to have a medical health ID, and it can be either paper for countries that are not able to have a digital one, or it will be digital, no doubt, in the developed countries. And what this is the pretext of it is that that we need to track everybody's vaccination status because we've got these terrible diseases, and we need to know, where outbreaks are, et cetera. But they're actually, these IDs are a complete threat to our democracy and to our freedom, because the health IDs will set up the infrastructure for the digital ID. Now, the chart that you see right here is from the World Economic Forum. And you can find it online just by looking at World Economic Forum, digital ID, and then doing an image search. So it's right there, very easy to find. And what you will see is that these digital IDs they say, "Oh, it'll make it so much easier, more convenient for you to access these various things that I'm about to tell you." But what it really is that if you step out of line, they can deny you access. So you will need a digital ID to access healthcare, to access financial services such as banking, to purchase things online, to travel, and just even have mobility, like taking the bus. You will be able to, you'll need a digital ID in order to have government services like, to have Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security, to own a communications device. So, for example, to own a cell phone or a computer, to participate in social media, to file your taxes, to vote. And then they've got a category for smart cities. And if anybody wants to hear about smart cities, I think you should ask during the questions. So these digital IDs will lead to mass surveillance and totalitarian control, and are already well along the way of being rolled out. more than a year ago, Dr. Tedros Ghebreyesus, who is the head of the World Health Organization, not a medical doctor, but and announced that he and the European Union are rolling these things out, interoperable, international. So what does that mean? Interoperable and international means that any country can see the data that's in there, including, for example, the Chinese Communist Party. So that's what the World Health Organization is up to. Another thing is, could I have the next slide called One Health? This One Health approach is in the pandemic treaty, which has not yet passed, but it's also all over the place. I mean, they've got One Health on the internet, in governmental agencies, etc., in universities. And I just want to alert you, you can see that this little slide is very colorful, very cute. You would almost expect to see it on, on the wall of the kindergarten or something. But what the One Health approach is, human health, animal health, plant health, and the environment are all related. And that relationship is being used as a pretext for the World Health Organization to be able to surveil and control any aspect of life on Earth. So if they see that there's going to be some kind of a pandemic or a disease, or they have a new category called pandemic emergency, which means a potential pandemic, which anything is a potential pandemic, that they will be able to be the ones who are issuing, the central control about how to handle that, so that this is a way for them to basically surveil and control every aspect of life on Earth. And One Health has never been really well defined. So there was one definition from the Lancet magazine. Could I have the next slide, please? And the Lancet magazine is a very prestigious medical journal. So on January 21st of 2023, they ran an article called One Health, a call for ecological equity. All right. And this is a quote. It says, "The consequences of this thinking entail a subtle but quite revolutionary shift of perspective. All life is equal and of equal concern. This understanding is fundamental to addressing the pressing health issues at the human-animal environment interface." So just think about that. You can take that slide down now, please. All life is equal and of equal concern. So what that does is it makes your life, my life, our children's lives, our parents' lives, our loved ones' lives equal and of equal concern to the life of a mosquito or a rat or a weed. And so they want to balance our interests against the interests of animal life and plant life. It's not like humans come first. Okay, we're just one animal among many, etc. And this also flies in the face of traditional religious beliefs, like God created people in his image and likeness, and that's not something that is shared by a rat or a mosquito or a weed. So it's really kind of a religion, I would argue. Now, that is the World Health Organization. The United Nations has recently come through with its own horrific agreement. This is on September 22nd, called the Pact for the Future. And in the Pact for the Future, they reiterate, the language in the World Health Organization about misinformation and disinformation, having to control it, basically censor it, as well as the hate speech. But then they also have this thing called complex global shocks. So in the Pact for the Future, they talk about strengthening the UN as the central control of international response to complex global shocks. And the wording complex global shocks, they don't really define it in the Pact for the Future, but it harks back to a policy brief that deals with complex global shocks. And you can see from the policy brief more detail on what they want. So let's see if I can find the exact language here. Yes, here it is. So in this policy brief is from the Secretary General, who is a socialist, Guterres, to the member states of the United Nations. He says, I, meaning Secretary Guterres, propose that the General Assembly of the United Nations provide the Secretary General and the United Nations system with standing authority to convene and operationalize automatically an emergency platform in the event of a future complex global shock of sufficient scale, severity, and reach. So what that means is that because this thing was adopted, that they don't have to go back to the nations and ask permission. It's like it's going to operationalize automatically. And by the way that this was adopted, talk about a threat to democracy. There was no debate. They did this through something called the silence procedure, and under the silence procedure, the committee that is responsible for coming up with an agreement, they come to a consensus. They send it to the Secretary General of the United Nations. The Secretary General of the United Nations posts it online, or maybe sends it out to the 193, emails it to them, to the member states. And then if nobody objects within a set time, the least time of which is 72 hours, it is adopted. Adopted. Okay? So this has been adopted through the silence procedure. So there was never debate on the floor of the United Nations. There was never debate in the member countries, and it affects us hugely because it makes the United Nations the central control and they get to define what is a complex global shock and to basically run the show. So here's their list of complex global shocks. Could I have the complex global shock slide, please? This comes from this policy brief. And as you can see, a complex global shock can be from climate. No, yes, there you go. Major climatic event, in other words, climate change, future pandemic risk, that would be handled through the WHO, biological warfare, okay, disruption to the global flows of goods or people. So in other words, if we have a supply chain disruption, and I don't know what they mean by disruption to the global flow of people. Does that mean if we close our border that they're going to consider that to be a complex global shock? We don't let people flow in? Cyberspace, global digital connectivity. In other words, if the grid goes down, if the internet goes down, then at the bottom you see there a major event in our outer space. So not only do they want to be, control the world, but they want to be masters of the universe. And then the last one is an unforeseen black swan event, which is anything they didn't think of. So if they decide that any one of these things, we can take that chart down now, please. If they decide that any one of these things is a complex global shock, then they're going to be playing the central role in how we handle it. That is the destruction of our democracy. It was very interesting. I was on a webinar or a summit with Nigel Farage from the UK maybe a month ago, and he said that from the very beginning that what the United Nations was about the destruction of the nation state. That they'd been in Europe through 2 brutal world wars, and that they. So they decided that nationalism or patriotism was the reason for these wars, and so they constructed the United Nations to get rid of nationalism, patriotism. It's always from its inception has been against the nation state. Now, talk about a threat to democracy. I don't see one that's even a greater threat than that. So, I guess can I have the last slide, please? I would just like to say that we are definitely in a situation where our freedoms, our democracy is at stake. It's very important who wins this election, because the Biden-Harris administration has been actually pushing these agendas, both within the World Health Organization and the United Nations. I guess you could take the last slide off now. And President Trump, I'm not going to endorse anybody because I am the head of a nonprofit, but I'm going to state a fact, which is that he withdrew us from the World Health Organization. Now, by the time that would have taken effect, Biden, put us right back in when he took office. But Trump is not playing their game. They hate him, which in my estimation is actually a recommendation for him. But anyway, things are moving very, very quickly. There are actions that you can take. And what I would ask everybody to do is to go to my website, which is antiglobalist.net, one word, antiglobalist.net, and sign the manifesto. And that will put you on my email list, my newsletter list, and then you will get updates about all of the things that are happening, and you'll be able to take action. Don't think you can wait until after the election or until after the holidays or whatever. It's going to be too late, because once we lose our freedom, it will be basically almost impossible to get it back. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Reggie. That was an excellent presentation, very informative and scary in a lot of ways. One question is, did one or two of these organizations, the WHO and/or the UN, as part of their power grab, say that they're going to put in place a representative in every country, and those representatives are going to be the implementers of the globalist change, and I guess Congress and the Senate has to be subservient to them? Say anything about that?
Yes. So that is another part of the amended international health regulations, is that every nation has to appoint an IHR, International Health Regulation authority, they call it, or focus point. They have two different names for this. And that person is going to be on U.S. soil or elsewhere. And if they have, if we have a Harris administration, they're going to be given a huge staff and a huge amount of power. And their job is to basically to police, to implement whether we are obeying what the WHO says nationally, including making sure that our laws are adjusted. Okay, so there's going to be this agency that answers to the WHO to make sure that our local, state, and federal laws are consistent with the World Health Organization amendments, International Health Regulation amendments. This again is just a direct attack on our sovereignty.
Yeah, and I don't suppose these people implementing the policies have to be nationals of the countries to which they're put in place. So we could have non-Americans telling us to adjust our laws.
True, that's true. It's a good point.
Okay. And then when you were talking about digital health, and I guess, digitize everybody's health, and I think you were saying that information would be available to everybody, including our enemies. The Chinese could determine which of our soldiers have asthma, which of our soldiers have allergies, and do something to try to trigger those medical events if there was a battle, if there was a war, right? I mean, they could do biological research and try to figure out how to damage people with certain characteristics, certain blood types, or DNA, I would imagine.
Right. I have no doubt that they've already been engaged in that kind of medical research. So that's right. That is another threat. And to say nothing of, let's just say, while we're on the subject of China, we've got, I don't know how many hundreds of thousands or millions of people going across our southern border, many of whom, like many tens of thousands of whom, are military-aged Chinese men. So what are they doing in our country? They kind of disappear into the country. That also is a threat to our democracy.
So my understanding is some very large organizations that were very pro-vaccine during the days of COVID exempted their employees from having to have a vaccine, from mandatory vaccines. I think Pfizer was one. If the WHO exempted their people from vaccines, and when?
Yeah, I am not sure about that. I mean, I've heard that, but I don't have the research on that at my fingertips. And that's more like a Meryl Nass question, and she's not here today, so she, I focus mostly on like sort of the legal threat to democracy, and she's more focused on the vaccine. But I would like to say this, which is that these things are treaties. All right. So under the treaty convention, the Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties, all it means for there to be a treaty is that it has to be a written instrument between nations in which they are making, promises to each other, and that's what these are. And there are people who are conservatives who are saying, "Oh, it's not a treaty, so we don't have to abide by it." That's number one. It's not true. We do have to abide by it, and like you said, there's an implementing authority in the WHO, and there are other implementing, language in the UN. So we are going to. They absolutely do intend to hold every nation accountable. But it's a weak argument to say, "Oh, well, it's not a treaty, so we don't have to abide by it." I think that they are trying to, again, comfort themselves by this, because if you get an administration in there like the Biden-Harris administration, you know, they're going to ram it down our throats, just like they did during COVID. They were not required to implement all the lockdowns, et cetera, by the WHO. They just did it because the WHO recommended it, and they went along with it. To say it's a treaty is a much more powerful position, because then it requires the advice and consent of the Senate. And what that does is it enables us to activate Congress to resist this. If we say it's not a treaty, then basically we have nothing to say to Congress. If we say it's a treaty, it's got to go through the Senate. Then we can get bills enacted like the one on the WHO. We can get one enacted for the United Nations and get the senators themselves to sign a letter saying this is a treaty and it needs to go through us for advice and consent. They did that with respect to the WHO. Again, I think, in large part because of our advocacy, Sovereignty Coalition. But the same thing needs to happen with respect to the United Nations. And because of the United Nations silence procedure, there was not the kind of protest against this leading up to it that there was with the World Health Organization, because nobody knew about it. And now it's passed, or it's been adopted, and we need to say this is a treaty, and it cannot be implemented in the United States without the advice and consent of the Senate. That's a very strong position, and it's true.
I would imagine the pressure to adopt these policies coming out of the WHO and the UN would be more profound with developing countries. A country that's dependent on IMF funding or World Bank funding, I believe there's some association. So if you don't comply with all of this nonsense, if you're Paraguay or Portugal, you may find that you don't have the loans you need, the financing you need from the World Bank or an organization like that.
That's why the way that the United Nations works is it's very easy to pressure or even blackmail countries into submission, because it's not just the IMF, but the Chinese Communist Party has loaned money to nations, and they're beholden to them, and they can't, if they threaten them with, okay, we're going to call your loan, or we're not going to provide you with these essential resources, they can basically coerce nations to fall into line. So that's a defect in the United Nations, the way it's set up. It's one country, one vote. So the United States vote is not any greater than the vote of the smallest country, Luxembourg or something. And countries that don't have money and that are are taking out loans can be pressured into voting certain ways that they wouldn't otherwise vote.
Right. I think you mentioned it, but just to reiterate how sweeping the authority is, my understanding is that WHO doesn't have to wait until there's an actual pandemic. They can trigger some of their policies just if there's a risk or a fear of a pandemic, or they include things like racism as a pandemic,
that's right.
or school shootings as a pandemic, or hate speech as a pandemic.
Right. So they created a new term in these international health regulation amendments. It's called pandemic emergency. Now, you would think that a pandemic emergency would be an emergency caused by a pandemic, but that's not the way they define it. They define it in their list of definitions at the beginning of the document, and a pandemic emergency is a potential pandemic. so they can. And what's a potential pandemic? Somebody sneezes in your face, and that's a, who knows? That's a potential pandemic. Who knows? So anything can be a potential pandemic, and so this thing can fly into operation with a potential pandemic, and they define health not just as human health, animal health, plant health, and the environment, but anything that impacts human health, which would be poverty, reproductive rights, gun violence, hate speech, anything that they can say is related to health, they believe that they have authority over.
There's a scary headline on the WHO's website, immunizing the public against misinformation.
Yes.
I don't think they're quite there yet, but I wouldn't put it past somebody at some point to really come up with a vaccine to immunize people against misinformation.
Okay, so what they're talking about is, and they also talk about, information integrity, and what they're talking about is basically brainwashing, and it starts with the kids, where they say these are the sources of information you pay attention to, and these are not. So you pay attention to the World Health Organization, United Nations, and all the mainstream media. You do not pay attention to, David Wanatick and Reggie Littlejohn, because they're not reliable. And it's just basically, in my opinion, a form of brainwashing, is what they're doing.
Yeah, so you spoke to us during our Lockdown Nation conference in February, and at that point I pointed out one of the pages on the WHO's website where they were boasting about all the censorship, boasting about how many articles they suppressed, and it was a very, very large number of censorship. And just for those people out there, we had a very learned doctor on that panel, Dr. David Bell, and I asked him if censorship is accretive to human health. It sounds funny, but the WHO is supposed to be watching after our health. They have this huge campaign against misinformation, and if censorship is good for our health and people living in places like it should be in great health. But Dr. David Bell said there's no causation, no correlation. Anyway, to what extent do you think an ultimate goal of the WHO or the UN is democide? They think anything we do is going to trigger a pandemic. A lot of people that are believers in globalism believe that there's too many people on the planet, and that there should be many fewer people. So to what extent do you think some of this thinking is driven by that concern? There some democidal people involved in these organizations.
Well, no one has come to me. There's no globalist that has come to me and confided that really what they want to do is, is democide. But you have to watch. You have to watch their actions, right? So the pandemic treaty, which has not passed, all right, and I don't know if it will or not. And like I said, even if it doesn't, they already have enough to install a global biotech security state. But in the pandemic treaty, they have something called the PABS system, Pathogen Access and Benefit Sharing System. So what is this? The PABS system means that if a country finds a pathogen with pandemic potential, so it's a PPP, pathogen with pandemic potential. So in other words, a dangerous virus that could cause a pandemic, they send it to the WHO, and then the WHO farms it out to all kinds of different labs all over the world, supposedly to develop a vaccine. Well, what could go wrong? If the COVID-19 pandemic was caused by a lab leak, and then you have these pathogens being sent out to all kinds of countries all over the world and all kinds of labs, you're just exponentially increasing the numbers of potential lab leaks. So is that deliberate democide, or is it just like stupidity? I don't know. But I'll tell you what the impact of it is also. is to keep the vaccine manufacturers in business, because there's going to be constant lab leaks of these different pathogens. And then the vaccine manufacturers are going to make a huge amount of money to create vaccines for these things and produce them. And it's also a pretext of keeping us in lockdown and in emergency mode in perpetuity. We're going to constant lab leaks, constant vaccines, constant lockdowns. So if this pandemic treaty, if they are able to make an agreement and it's going to come up for, I don't know if they will even vote on it. I mean, they pass things by the silence is consent kind of thing. That's how the international health regulations were passed. You know, that, you tell me whether the intent of that is democide.